Let's dispense with the polite fiction that this was a war. A war has an objective. A war has a front line. A war has a metric for victory. The global war on terror had none of these things. It was structurally and financially a Ponzi scheme armed with Hellfire missiles. We took $8 trillion, wealth generated by the labor of the American middle class, and we set it on fire in the burn pits of Bagram and Fallujah. To visualize this theft, imagine that for the last 20 years, every single hour of every single day, the United States government took $45 million out of the Treasury and handed it to a defense contractor. And what was the return on investment? We replaced the Taliban with the Taliban. We replaced Saddam Hussein with ISIS. We turned the Middle East into a centrifuge of chaos that spun out refugees and radicals faster than we could count them. If this were a private company, the entire board of directors would be in federal prison for fraud. But in Washington, we call it nation building. We didn't buy security, we financed our own decline. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled wasn't convincing the world he didn't exist, it was convincing the US Congress to sign the authorization for use of military force on September 18, 2001. This wasn't just a law, it was an abdication. In a panic-fueled haze barely a week after the towers fell, 518 representatives and senators voted to hand the president the keys to the kingdom. Only one person, Barbara Lee, voted no. One. The AUMF was 60 words of legislative poison. It allowed the president to wage war against anyone, anywhere, at any time without further consultation, as long as he could vaguely link them to terror. It destroyed the separation of powers. It turned the commander-in-chief into a king. By defining the enemy as a tactic, terror, instead of a state, Congress ensured that the war could legally never end. You cannot sign a peace treaty with a noun. You cannot surrender to an adjective. They created a perpetual motion machine for conflict. We like to think this war was a mistake born of anger. It wasn't. It was a calculated experiment by men who thought they were gods. The architects, the Cheneys, the Rumsfelds, the Wolfowitzes, suffered from a terminal case of imperial narcissism. They operated under a delusion called the end of history. They genuinely believed that American democracy was an exportable commodity like Coca-Cola or Levi's jeans. They thought you could flatten a complex, tribal, millennia-old civilization with JDAM bombs, pour some concrete, hold an election, and suddenly everyone would want to buy a mortgage from Goldman Sachs. They viewed countries like Iraq and Afghanistan not as distressed assets waiting to be flipped by private equity. It was intellectual colonialism. They didn't care about the culture, the language, or the history of the people they were liberating. They only cared about the map. They were playing a game of Risk in an air-conditioned room while 19-year-old kids from Ohio were bleeding out in the dust to test their theories. The most damning moment of the entire saga happened in December 2001 at Tora Bora. We had him. We had Osama bin Laden trapped in a cave complex. The CIA officers on the ground were screaming for reinforcements. They needed a battalion of Rangers to seal the back door to Pakistan. And Washington said no. Why? Why would you refuse to capture the man who killed 3,000 Americans? Because capturing bin Laden in 2001 would have been a disaster for the business plan. If you catch the villain in the first reel, you can't justify the budget for the rest of the movie. The Pentagon was already pivoting. They were pulling satellites and special forces off the hunt for al-Qaeda and redirecting them toward Iraq. They used the trauma of 9/11 as a bait and switch to sell a war against a dictator who had zero connection to the attacks. It was the ultimate cynicism. They kept the boogeyman alive so they could invade a completely different country that had better oil fields. But how do you legally justify invading a sovereign nation that didn't attack you? How do you twist the law until it snaps? You need lawyers. Lots of them. War usually happens on a battlefield, but the war on terror was truly fought in a conference room at the Department of Justice, specifically in the Office of Legal Counsel, OLC. Here, a group of Ivy League lawyers, men who had never held a rifle but could weaponize a thesaurus, performed a miracle of linguistic alchemy. They were tasked with a simple problem. The United States wanted to torture people, but the United States had signed treaties promising never to torture people. So they didn't change the law, they changed the dictionary. John Yoo, a legal scholar with the moral flexibility of a Cirque du Soleil performer, drafted the infamous torture memos. The argument was breathtaking in its depravity. They argued that for an act to legally constitute torture, the pain must be equivalent to major organ failure or death. Think about that standard. If I waterboard you until your lungs fill with fluid and your brain screams for oxygen, but your liver doesn't technically fail, that's not torture, that's just enhanced interrogation. They turned the Geneva Convention into a suggestion box. They created a golden shield for the CIA, ensuring that no matter what atrocities were committed in a black site in Thailand, the agents could say, "The lawyers told us it was legal." If you want to break the law, you have to find a place where the law doesn't live. Enter Guantanamo Bay. Why did we choose a naval base in Cuba to hold our prisoners? Was it the nice weather? No, it was a calculated exploit of jurisdiction. The Bush administration argued that since Gitmo was technically Cuban soil, the U.S. Constitution didn't apply there. But since the U.S. military controlled it, Cuban law didn't apply there either. It was a legal black hole, a juridical purgatory. To fill this hole, they invented a new category of human being, the enemy combatant. This term exists nowhere in international law. If you call them prisoners of war, they get rights under the Geneva Convention. If you call them criminal defendants, they get rights under the U.S. Constitution, like a lawyer and a trial. By calling them enemy combatants, they got nothing. They could be held indefinitely, without charge, without trial, until the end of hostilities. And remember, since the war is against an emotion, terror, the hostilities never end. We created a parking lot for human beings where the rule of law was towed away at the owner's expense. While the lawyers were dismantling international law, Congress was busy dismantling domestic privacy. The USA Patriot Act was 342 pages long. It was introduced, debated, and passed in 3 days. I guarantee you not a single person who voted for it actually read it. If they had, they might have noticed they were signing the death warrant for the Fourth Amendment. This act allowed the government to search your home without notifying you, sneak and peek. It allowed the FBI to turn the entire internet into a wiretap. The irony was palpable. We were told we were fighting a war to protect our freedoms, and the very first thing we did was surrender them. We burned the village to save it. We created a surveillance architecture so vast that the Stasi would have wept with envy, all under the premise that if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. Tell that to the millions of Americans whose metadata is now sitting in a server farm in Utah. Even with the torture memos and the black sites, sometimes the U.S. government felt squeamish. Sometimes the optics of an American boot on a human face were just too bad for CNN. So we adopted the corporate model, outsourcing. This was called extraordinary rendition. The CIA would kidnap a suspect in Milan or Stockholm, drug them, put them on a private jet, usually a shell company like Premier Executive Transport Services, and fly them to a friendly dictatorship like Egypt, Syria, or Libya. We effectively handed human beings over to regimes we knew used electric drills on prisoners, and we pretended our hands were clean. We asked them questions, sent them to a dungeon in Cairo, and waited for the answers to be faxed back. It was money laundering, but for moral culpability. We didn't torture, we just provided the Uber ride to the torture chamber. But all of this, the torture, the surveillance, the black sites, was supposedly necessary to stop the enemy. It was the hard power. But what happens when the hard power meets the soft power of pure, unadulterated corruption? What happens when the military isn't trying to win, but trying to spend? If you thought the legal gymnastics were bad, wait until you see the accounting, or rather the lack thereof. In the early days of the Iraq occupation, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York shipped approximately $12 billion in physical cash to Baghdad. I want you to visualize this. We didn't wire the money. We didn't write a check. We loaded C-130 cargo planes with shrink-wrapped pallets of $100 bills, flew them into a war zone, and handed them out like party favors. This was the Coalition Provisional Authority, CPA, in action. It was the Wild West, but with less oversight. Auditors later found that billions of dollars simply vanished. There were no receipts. There were no ledgers. American contractors were carrying duffel bags of cash out the back doors of the Green Zone. We effectively airlifted the GDP of a small nation into a desert and let it evaporate. It wasn't just incompetence. It was a piñata party for the well-connected, funded by your payroll tax. How do you turn a war into a guaranteed profit machine? You use a magic spell called the cost-plus contract.
In a normal economy, if I hire you to build a school, I pay you a fixed price. If you go over budget, that's your problem. But companies like KBR and Halliburton operated on cost plus. This means the government pays for all your expenses plus a guaranteed percentage of profit on top. Do you see the perverse incentive? The more money you waste, the more profit you make. If you buy a $5 towel, you get a 50-cent profit. If you buy a $100 towel, you get $10 profit. Suddenly, the military was paying $100 for a bag of laundry and $45 for a six-pack of Coca-Cola. We built ghost schools in Afghanistan, structures that were marked as complete on a spreadsheet in Washington, but in reality were just 4 walls with no roof, no teachers, and no students. We spent millions on a soybean program for Afghan farmers, apparently forgetting that Afghans don't eat soy. We weren't building a nation, we were laundering money through a construction project that was never meant to be finished. The crown jewel of this failure was the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, ANDSF. We spent $83 billion training them. We gave them Black Hawk helicopters, Humvees, and night vision goggles. On paper, they were a 300,000-man modern army. In reality, they were a fiction. A massive chunk of that army consisted of ghost soldiers. Corrupt Afghan commanders would create fake names on the payroll, collect the US-funded salaries, and pocket the cash. Washington knew this, the Pentagon knew this, but nobody stopped it because high troop numbers looked good on PowerPoint slides presented to Congress. We created an army modeled after our own, reliant on expensive air support and complex logistics. The moment we pulled the contractors who maintained the helicopters, the Afghan Air Force was grounded. We didn't build an army that could fight for Afghanistan, we built an army that could only fight with American supervision. When we left, the 300,000-strong force evaporated in 11 days because you cannot bribe a soldier to die for a government that is stealing his paycheck. Why did this go on for 20 years? Why did no general ever stand up and say, "This isn't working"? Because losing a war is bad for the country, but it's fantastic for your career. We witnessed the complete corporatization of the officer class. A general would oversee a disastrous campaign in Kandahar, retire with a full pension, and within months join the board of directors of Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, or General Dynamics. This is the revolving door. The men deciding which weapons to buy are the same men who will eventually be paid by the companies selling them. If a general ended the war quickly and cheaply, he would be destroying his future job market. The incentive structure was perfectly aligned to sustain the conflict, not to resolve it. We created a class of warrior CEOs who managed the war like a quarterly earnings call, where progress was always just around the corner, usually requiring just one more budget increase to turn the tide. But now, the money is gone, the troops are home, mostly, the Taliban is back, and the American public is left staring at the wreckage, asking the final, terrifying question: was this just a mistake? Or was this the plan all along?
While we were busy playing whack-a-mole in the desert for 2 decades, the rest of the world didn't stop turning. History hates a vacuum, and it hates a distracted superpower even more. While the United States spent $8 trillion blowing up bridges in Fallujah, China spent trillions building bridges in Africa, ports in Pakistan, and high-speed rail in Europe. This is the true cost of the war. It's not just the money we lost, it's what we didn't buy with it. We engaged in imperial overstretch so severe it would make the Romans blush. We neglected our own infrastructure, our own grid, and our own schools to fund a police action on the other side of the planet. We looked at the chessboard of the 21st century and decided to spend 20 years obsessing over a single pawn, while our competitors were busy capturing the rest of the board. We didn't just lose the war, we lost the future. There is an old maxim in political science, Foucault's boomerang. It states that the methods an empire uses on its colonies eventually come back home to be used on its own citizens. Look around. The war on terror didn't stay in Baghdad. It came to your local police department. Why does a sheriff's office in a town of 5,000 people need a mine-resistant ambush-protected MRAP vehicle? Why do local police wear digital camo and carry assault rifles? Because the surplus gear from our forever wars had to go somewhere. We militarized our own streets. We normalized the surveillance state. The NSA tools built to track Al-Qaeda are now capable of tracking you. We imported the mindset of the occupation. We ceased to be citizens and became civilians in a battle space.
The war didn't protect our freedom. It slowly, quietly, and legally eroded it. So, was it all for nothing? If you are a soldier who lost a leg or a taxpayer who lost their retirement, the answer is yes, it was a tragedy. But if you are a shareholder in the defense industrial complex, it was a resounding triumph. The stock prices of the top 5 defense contractors outperformed the S&P 500 by 58% during the war. From a capitalist perspective, the war on terror was a masterpiece. It successfully transferred public wealth into private portfolios with zero accountability. Dwight Eisenhower warned us about the military-industrial complex. He feared it would influence policy, but he was too optimistic. It didn't just influence policy, it became the policy. We created a self-licking ice cream cone, a system designed to consume resources to justify its own existence, requiring an eternal enemy to sustain its eternal budget. In the end, the war on terror wasn't won or lost. It was simply closed out like a bad business deal. We left the same way we arrived, in chaos, leaving behind a broken country and a stronger enemy. The lesson is brutal but necessary. You cannot bomb a concept, you cannot shoot an ideology, and you cannot build a democracy at gunpoint. The era of the global war on terror is officially over, but the machine that built it is still humming, looking for the next dragon to slay. The names change, the maps change, but the receipt remains the same. This is the Shadow Broker. If you are tired of the sanitized history, if you want to see the ledger the government tries to shred, and if you want to understand the machinery behind the madness, do your civic duty. Smash that subscribe button for Julian Arsenal. We don't sell comforting lies here. We trade in the black data. Thank you for watching. Class is dismissed.